the Spire, Chapter 1. Admiral Lothar Horst stood on the bridge of the H.I.M.S. Dominator, looking out to the great unexplored mass of the universe which surrounded them. He looked out towards the gap in reality which had become known as the Scream of Man, with a mixture of fear and horror. It was the first time that he had taken a crew this deep into the Well of Souls at the eastern arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and the trepidation he had felt on accepting such a task was now entirely justified by the sheer mind-bending universe-shifting powers of the astrophysical anomaly. He stared in its heart, looking at the ever-changing shapes and colours of the bizarre phenomena. All around him men and women rushed around the deck, dressed in various equally dazzling colours and dress types. Blue-clad engineers garbled technical speak incomprehensible to any whom had not had decades of training at the Imperial Technical Universities. Their language was a language of numbers, nouns and verbs not common in any other form of human or alien speech. Warfare officers dressed in white with gold embroidery shouted at each other from across the deck, preferring to communicate orally rather than through the poorly built new mental communication devices which the military had also mistakenly bought a century prior. Slaves dressed in orange worked away on repairs towards the rear of the room, and to the left and right of Horst stood two men dressed in black and grey respectively. He looked down to the various selection of screens hardwired into the pristine white metal of the central control system. These screens were feeding back to him a vast selection of data from all over the ship. He looked down towards the sound wave analyzer. The sound waves were spiking at levels which he had never before seen, as if the thing that they were analyzing was screaming across the empty vacuum of space. Explosions were being registered by the other data terminals, explosions which seemed to be occurring all over the ship, and 3 sections of the ship's slave stock seemed to be revolting in the holding bay. The situation was dire, as one by one the engineers began to register faults within their internal mechanisms. A terrible sound then knocked the newly promoted admiral off his senses, as the man to the right of him let out a howling screech of pain. He was grasping his headset and had fallen to his knees. Medical staff rushed over to him, but it was too late. The man's face was becoming red, and the admiral stood back to permit for the cranial explosion that was to follow. The headset around the back of the man's head was beeping furiously, and the scream he was letting out continued unabated. To the left of the admiral was his co-commander in grey. But the commander was not actually there, and mentally he was on the third deck, projecting his holograph self into the anarchy which the tertiary command centre had turned into upon encroaching upon the wound in space which they were now entranced by. The admiral was, however, an officer of the Imperial Navy of the Empire of Humankind, and although maybe not the oldest of admirals in the Navy, he was perhaps one of the most determined. And determination would be what he needed to complete the mission. At last, the mental storm which had taken over his secondary co-commander culminated in the explosion of the poor man's head, which popped with a loud bang, covering the admiral's pristine new white and gold uniform with bright red blood, which gently slid down his jacket. He looked briefly to the right at the now headless corpse of his second-in-command, and winced slightly. Now, however, was not time to be distracted, and he barked orders at the nearest officer to him to quickly assume the second-in-command role. The poor young officer, whom had received the orders, looked barely 18, and had little choice but to accept, and plugged himself into the headset, still dripping with the blood and cranial fluid of his predecessor. The admiral looked out to the long, expansive deck, which penetrated forward into the blackness of space. The lights of the sprawling, urban-like structures protruding from the front of his ship were the only lights not swallowed up by the spatial anomaly. As the ship entered the very outer edges of the almost sentient being hiding in this small pocket of space, what seemed like a kind of wind began to blow the ship around from side to side, up and down, shaking everything on deck. People began to fall over and crash into consoles. One of the slaves, holding a propane torch repair kit, dropped it upon an exposed energy well, detonating a mini-explosion at the rear of the building. Amid the fire and flames now encompassing almost half of the bridge, the Admiral showed no sign of stopping the drive towards the hole in reality. "Admiral, you must turn us around. Give the order. The engine, she's beginning to falter. I've lost 4 of the 12 already, and the slaves are dying at a rate which I cannot replace, and if I lose any more, then we'll be pulled straight into the anomaly itself." "I care little for the engineers or the slaves who power them. Keep us afloat and keep us moving. That is an order, Callan." The Admiral could hear the static start up like it did whenever a message was coming back to him, and he was preparing to order the man's execution by firing squad, when then everything went black. The noise stopped, and only the whispered noise of terrified humans could be heard. The darkness was absolute. The emergency lights failed. The data readers were dead. The computers had faltered, and the mental command links had broken. Only the fires activated by the commotion before had remained alight. They burned dully in the background, taking advantage of the only thing that had seemed to have not failed, the internal oxygen supply, and of course the gravity generators which kept them rooted to the ground. The Admiral's heart beat fast, and a fast mix of fear and excitement overcame him, for finally they had at last reached their objective. The ship had given out, and he had accomplished his mission. But now he would have to get them home, and with a deep sense of anticipation he crawled towards the consoles to look out across his ship to examine the situation across the board. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. It had not only been the bridge to give out, but the whole ship. No lights, not even in the habitation blocks. He heard a whispered, hushed voice next to him. "Sir, what do we do now?" "You'll see." With a smile across his face, a knowing look on his brow, and an unrivalled confidence in his voice, he called over a young communications officer, whose red tunic was just about visible from the distant light which was cast by the anomaly, and now seemed to be the only light source for bridge personnel. The anomaly's light was an eerie, slight purple one, which made everything vaguely difficult to see, and was only visible once one's eyes had adjusted to the pitch darkness. He could vaguely make out the officer coming towards him, walking slightly cowed and unconfidently in the darkness. "I need you to communicate a message straight down to the engine room. Can you do that for me?" Of course, sir. I can send a dollar communication through the dollar network. It'll reach him in a matter of minutes. Is the delay okay?" "Yes, that's fine. But make sure you whisper it loud and clear. Tell him to activate the parallel energy generators." Far down below, in the ship's underbelly, was the hellish dominion of the engine slaves. The corridors were narrow and twisted. They bent around thousands of corners, were lined with boiling hot or freezing cold pipes, and always seemed as if they had their own dark radiating energy which made a slow, subconscious noise, inaudible to the normal human hearing range, but not unaudible to aliens. It made most life forms uncomfortable, but was an impossibly important part of the ship. However, something about the engine deck on this ship was more unnerving than most ships, and even experienced slaves like Alpha Zeta 112 felt that more acutely here than most. He was marching with his team up and down the engine pipes, checking for nascent signs of activity within the system. The 3 of them walked in single file, hemmed in by a horrifying feeling of claustrophobia which seemed to swallow them whole. but being a slave gives one little choice about the assignments which is taken on by them, and Alpha Zeta had long got used to the discomfort of the world that he had been forced into. He had belonged to the Imperial Navy all his life, and in reality it wasn't too bad. He wasn't mining sulphur on some forgotten moon of an industrialized hellscape. Neither was he a do-nothing butler in a sprawling human pleasure estate where there was nothing to do but get cheeky massages. No, instead he had had a life of being whipped, seeing beautifully constructed space stations, executing disobedient slaves, witnessing the impossibly majestiful expanse of space, and experiencing all the brutal realities of naval life. And he wouldn't have missed out for most of it in all the world, in all the 4 galaxies. But despite all the places he had served, there was something about this ship which he didn't like in particular. There was something unnatural about it, unnerving and uncomfortable, almost as if the ship didn't quite belong in this reality. They were travelling through Section 18 when they first heard it. Alpha Zeta stopped his team of infrared-capable engineer slaves and waited in the darkness to hear the noise again. He could hardly hide his shock when he realized what it was. "That's a dollar communication," he whispered under his breath, but he was certain that that is what it was. It was coming through the metal of all the pipes. It was singing, in fact, rushing through, going towards the engine room control centre. Looking through the infrared vision which his species was capable of allowed him to see the effect that the dollar communication was having on the crew all over the engine deck. 4 armed Zilovites arose from their slumber at the top of the engine pipes. Rolazine insectoids crawled from the cooling cavities in the ceiling, and Irki flyers were all waking up hours before their night shift, which would have normally started in another 4 or 5 hours. The dollar communication had whizzed through their senses, passing through their bodies and minds with ease, waking them up. In the engine room, far deeper into the labyrinthine power decks, human technical specialists began to sense too the dollar communication. "Sir, do you hear that? My God, I think I do. Jefferson, call up the scientist from his studies and get him here. I can hear the dolomite through the pipes." Right away, sir." The chief engineer was elated in his manner. So scared was he when the lights had gone out, so afraid of the inevitable destruction of their vessel and the 100,000+ slaves under his roster, that he had begun to gather the most treasured of his slaves in prayer, and was in the middle of an impromptu mass when the message was finally heard. Although he could not see it clearly through the utter darkness of the engine room, only illuminated by 3 candles at his makeshift altar, he could nonetheless hear the gathering and the moving of hundreds of creatures in the dark, creatures which were now clattering in their own languages in a somewhat excited manner. The junior engineer, whom had been dispatched to the scientist's office, ran as cautiously and as quickly as he could down the thin pipe which separated the science department from the engineering deck. Just as he was about to get to the door separating the 2 decks, however, the door opened with a creak, and standing in the doorway was the man whom he had been sent to fetch. He looked like the kind of man you would see in a book about wizards or magic, a long, thin human with a beard stretching to just above his knees, with thick spectacles held together by tape in the middle, and a tall, dirty, once-upon-a-time white coat, which was only visible through a dull turquoise light provided by a makeshift-looking object made of sellotape and rusted metal, but which the scientists had somehow managed to manufacture into a makeshift light source. "Oh, hello, boy. I got the Dola message. He was most obliging messenger, but he didn't mind powering this light for me." The man held out the makeshift light, and the young officer looked within it. There, flying about, was a small-bodied Dolomite male. The officer had never seen one before, seeing as they were only used in emergencies, and every ship only had 5 or 6 aboard. It was a remarkable creature, but he had little time to engage in conversation about the wonders of xenobiology with the old man. "Quickly, we don't have time. We're too close to the—"
"My boy, I've been travelling space with this navy since before your father was born, I imagine. I'm perfectly aware of the danger that we're in. You can feel the gravity pull from here, but soon all will be well. Just take me to the engine."
The scientist stumbled into the cavernous room, illuminating it with the dolomite residing within his makeshift torch. A chorus of infrared-seeing aliens greeted him, and he smiled as he heard their myriad of languages, understanding most of them, smiling even greater when he realized that they were all asking for the same thing: for him to save them from the ravages of space, a request all too familiar to scientists all over the great Empire of Humankind. And the chief engineer, illuminated by the candlelight, ran over, energetically bouncing over to the scientist. He was moving in a great hurry, and he spoke as anxiously as he moved. "Thank God you're here. What did the message say?"
"Well, my friend, it asked me to activate the secret weapon, whose feasibility you are here on the edge of space to test."
The man walked over to the towering spire-like machine, which seemed inactive, as dead as all the other machines in this cathedral of engineering. He looked up at the being of steel and iron, and with wistful eyes he put his hands on the cold metal surface. He traced his finger across the illegible alien runes, and then took something glowing out of his bottommost pocket. The chief engineer looked over his shoulder to try and see what it was, but before he could ask, the scientist had rubbed the runes with the object, and a stuttering sound began to echo through the cold chamber. It roared up in the pipes, and a deep booming mechanical whir started up. The metal of the construct vibrated powerfully, and it began to glow red with heat. Everybody stood back and looked up at the towering example of ancient engineering, marvelling at the sound and colours. Sparks flew off the tubes which connected it to the piping, and a violent electric field of bright green colour sent manic spikes of extra-universal electricity outwards. Then, one by one, the data dials on the command console behind the chief engineer began to light up. The low red lights which characterized this part of the ship began to come back online. The alien slaves and their human supervisors could suddenly see each other again, and a roar of approval sounded throughout the gathered manpower there. And smiles were on the faces of all whom were present. On the bridge, the emergency lighting woke up and lit the place in a bright orange light, which whirred around as the ship's emergency protocols came online. The alarm sounded loud and clear, and the room was full of equally raucous cheers, and for the first time since the Battle of the Karnak Void, Admiral Lothar Horst smiled too. He looked out across the ship, and all the lights were coming back online. The telemetry computers that made up his command console began beeping and whirring, and his personal computer began to boot up. The computer wells, which housed the majority of bridge staff, all came back online, albeit running their emergency warfare protocols. The ship rocked from side to side once more, sending powerful but this time positive shock waves across the physical construct of the ship. The warships began to slowly but surely move away from the wound in space, and started to escape the powerful gravitational pull, almost as if the two energies were repelling each other so violently that they were being spewed out by this monstrous creature of pure energy. The Admiral, back on his feet, clasped his hands behind his back and began to broadcast his holographic presence to the engine department. The chief engineer was busy giving a rabble-rousing speech to the slaves, whom stood assorted beneath him, all standing to attention. His strong earth accent was projecting itself across the room as he used the language of sailors, mechanics, electricians, soldiers, and common men empire over. Replete with its slang and swears, he was speaking a language of real people, free from the pretension and officer worship of the Navy as a whole. features which were best left out when congratulating real achievement. But as he did so, the hologram of the Admiral and the captain of the ship broke through, and the whole crowd stood open-mouthed at such an honour as to see the projected presence of such a high-ranking official was rare, bordering on the never, for slaves and engineers. "I only came to offer you my greatest thanks. Without your service, such a task could never have been possible. Your services to this ship, to the Empire, and to the Navy has been great this day. So great that when we next dock, you will mingle with alien and man alike, free of your bonds of servitude. In gratitude for your actions as engineers, technicians, and leaders, and it is with that news that I announce our next port. This goes out to all men, aliens, women, and robots on all frequencies. The course is set for the Spire." With that, the engines powered up, the officers took their proud places, and the ship, riding the waves of opposing force, vomited them out of the pull of the anomaly and flew directly back into the brightness of normal astrophysical rules. The ship shot off into the distance, destined for the greatest port in the galaxy, the Spire. End of Chapter 1.